Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and in 2018 there were over 48,000. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. In Maryland, there were 630 suicide deaths. On average, one person dies from suicide every 14 hours. This week, the Maryland chapter, the American Foundation for the Prevention of Suicide, went to Annapolis to meet with lawmakers on ways to improve mental health and prevent suicide. With us this morning is Kat Ulbrich. She is director of the Maryland and Delaware chapters, and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, what sense do you get about where we are in terms of suicide and what seems to be, as I've seen some of the statistics, it seems to be a growing problem. It's not just something that's static, but that it seems to be increasing.
Yeah, so unfortunately the suicide rate keeps going up. So in the last 2 years we saw a little bit more of an increase than usual. So as you mentioned before, in 2018 we lost over 48,000 Americans to suicide. However, compared to the 2017 data, the rate actually slowed down. So there was an increase of 4% in 2017, and in 2018, which is our latest data, it was only 1.4%. So there's definitely a trend of that it slows down. And we also know that 3 states actually had a reduction. So one of them was Utah, South Carolina, and I forgot the third.
That's all right. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we've seen a slowdown?
Well, we are not quite sure yet because there's still some data coming out. So the Center for Disease Control only published the national data and not the states specifically. But one idea could be just the awareness around suicide and suicide prevention, the fact that we talk about it more. But also states are just being more active in starting to prevent it by providing better mental health care, bringing programs to schools, just raising more awareness in general.
Is there any certain part of the population that is more subject to this kind of thing, the suicide?
Yeah, so everybody could be at risk, and there's some groups that have a higher risk factors. So if you have an underlying mental health condition, you're automatically at a higher risk. However, it does not mean that you have to go on and die by suicide. But currently, the group that has the highest suicide rate are male aged 45 to 55. And most of it can be explained by the fact that they are most likely to have access to firearms. And firearms are usually lethal. So we're a huge advocate for firearm safety, making sure that if you have a mental health condition or somebody in your family struggles with mental health, that you store your firearms safely.
So now, you folks been in Annapolis. What are you urging lawmakers to do?
Yeah, so each year our chapter meets with the local legislators, and we actually schedule a meeting with them, and we talk about how suicide impacts Maryland. But our field advocates, so our volunteers, actually share their personal story with the legislators. And we want them to realize that suicide or mental health can impact anyone at any time. So that this is something that actually affects their community. But we also let them know that suicide can be prevented by providing more research, education, or providing also support for loss survivors.
Is there any particular legislation that you're looking at in order to improve the prospects in terms of suicide?
So there are actually 6 bills. One concerns veterans, where we want to make sure that they get the right services that they need, but also providing more education on mental health. One focuses on law enforcement, making sure that law enforcement has a better understanding about mental health, how to interact with people that have mental health conditions, but also taking care of their own mental health. And there's some other legislation where we focus mostly on mental health services and that people get the right services they need.
Does this mean that the state should be, say, spending more money on these services, or what is it that you might be looking for there?
So as in most counties, we see that mental health is really underfunded, so making sure that there are enough services, but also making sure the person doesn't have any doesn't have to wait a long period of time to get those services. Right now, the communication between somebody being taken to the ER and then what's the follow-up is very complicated. So what services are available to that person and how can we get them the help the fastest?
Now, one of the bills that is going to be apparently been introduced is a suicide assistance bill. I guess it's called the Richard E. Israel and Roger Pip Moyer End of Life Option Act. I understand it is obviously opposed by the Maryland Against Physician-Assisted Suicide. What's your sense about that bill? Where do you guys stand with all of that?
Yeah, as a national organization, we currently don't take a stand on that bill. Our national advocacy team is still exploring the bill, and since we are representing all the chapters, we have to look at it individually per chapter. But as of right now, we did not make a decision on that.
Right. In general, how's your organization view these kinds of pieces of legislation?
We take a look at it in general, so it's definitely on our radar, but there has been no decision specific to this kind of bills that are called the Bills for Life, or just in terms of assisted suicide, there has been no decision yet.
Does legislation like this make one nervous about what the implications might be?
Not really. We've been dealing with this for the last couple of years, and we really want to make sure that our message is that the suicide that we are talking about is related mostly to mental health, and that people get the right mental health services they need. So in the past, we've been approached from legislators to discuss those things, and we really want to make sure that we provide the resources that we have right now and support the knowledge that we have right now. And we just need to do a little bit more digging and research on the assisted suicide.
Now, I understand that Anne Arundel County has declared a suicide public health crisis and has ordered the health department to take immediate steps to offer treatment, especially of those who are at risk at suicide. What do you make of that? Is that a step forward? Are other counties doing similar kinds of things?
So we actually supported this with the councilman folk and really supportive of it. However, we just need to see what's the follow-up. So this is the key right now. It's great to have this in place to get started, to have a conversation. But what is the follow-up? Is it even possible to have the right mental health services, enough mental health services? He also mentioned firearm safety. So it's definitely something we want to support. And we do have programs that could be helpful. The question is, what is the next step, and what steps is the county taking? And each county is encouraged to look into this and making sure that they take action in suicide prevention, because suicide can be prevented.
Now, one of the things, by the way, that Volker mentioned was the fact that he decided to favor this kind of effort after the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. And one of the statistics that he points to that really, I think, probably turned his head was the 67% of firearm deaths, I guess between 2013 and 2017, that they were ruled suicides. I mean, that certainly has an impact, especially counties that obviously have a certain amount of rural areas where guns are certainly something that people have on a regular basis. Yeah,
so on the national level, actually, we know that 51% of all suicides are completed with a firearm. So what we advocate for is that people really think about this in more detail, that if they have a firearm in their house, that they store it safely. Because it's crucial to put time between the thought of suicide and the action. So if I know that my firearm is stored safely, maybe even store ammunition in a different place or outside of the house to keep myself or my family safe, that will be super helpful to also prevent suicide.
What should people be looking for in terms of whether or not there's a loved one or even a friend may very well be contemplating suicide, but nonetheless we often go about our daily lives without really noticing the signs?
Yes, and this is the tricky part because everybody communicates differently, and this is also how, everybody has a different language about communicating. And so when people show signs of suicide, they might not be clear. But sometimes people really state that they're thinking about suicide, and I urge you to take them serious. But sometimes people talk about feeling like a burden to their family, feeling about not having a reason to live, just talking about giving away possessions that are important to them. For example, their car or maybe their TV, whatever is important to them. Their behavior often changes drastically. So anytime something is off, when they start drinking too much or maybe abusing drugs, if they sleep too much or too little, if they start acting recklessly, that's a great opportunity for you to reach out and ask if everything is okay. Also ask directly about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? Using the word suicide is not going to plant the idea in their head. It actually makes them realize that you care and that you're somebody that they can talk to. And also mood changes. So if somebody all of a sudden snaps at you for no reason, is agitated, signs of anxiety, please reach out to them and have a conversation about mental health and getting the right mental health services.
How much does, say, for instance, things like finance or stress at work have to do with those who may very well wind up committing suicide, especially for those that I think you really sort of indicated earlier, as they get on in years and they're facing job issues, which, once you're in your 50s, it becomes more and more difficult. What kind of role do those factors play?
Definitely. So keep in mind that there's not one single reason why somebody dies by suicide. So nobody dies because they lost their job or because they were going through divorce. There's always a number of factors that have to come together. So if on the tip of the iceberg, you might see the job loss or the divorce. At the bottom, they might have been struggling with their mental health for a while. They had additional stressors. Maybe they lost a loved one or something at work was very stressful, and they might start drinking more than usual. So just keep in mind there's always more than one factor. But every time somebody goes through a life crisis or life change, please just pay more attention to their behavior and their actions, and always make sure that they have somebody to talk to, that you're a trusted person that they can reach out to when they feel alone or in crisis.
So have you encountered suicide yourself in terms of anyone you knew or people that you've known?
Yes. So my great-grandfather and one of my teachers died by suicide. And I work with a lot of volunteers that had a loss in their families or struggle with their mental health. So it's near to my heart.
So what was that like for you? Were you close to them, or how did your reaction, and did you have enough knowledge to recognize how to feel about it?
Yes, so this is actually why I'm so passionate about this, because that's a couple years ago. And when it happened, it was not really talked about. It was brushed aside. And back then, that's more than 20 years ago, we had a little knowledge about what suicide is, what causes suicide. So now knowing more about mental health and how it impacts the way we think and act is really important. So it makes me more aware of my own personal mental health, but also my family's actions and their mental health. So I can reach out whenever I feel like there might be signs of struggle or even suicidal thoughts.
What was that moment like for you when you were told?
I was in my early teens, so I'm not sure if it really, if I was able to process properly. But in hindsight, there were clearly signs, and that is kind of upsetting because if you had known what the consequence was, you could have, interfered. So with survivors, it's always a part of you is guilty about this. But I want to encourage every loss survivor that we know a lot afterwards, and it's okay. It's important to be proactive and now help others to see those signs and just be more aware of somebody's mental health.
Do people have a tendency to feel responsible because they didn't see it?
Do they have, sorry, can you repeat that question?
Do people feel responsible because they didn't see the signs?
Yes, so often loss survivors feel very guilty, and that is a normal reaction. But we really encourage you to not, blame yourself for it. It's just really hard to see signs sometimes. And as I mentioned before, each of us has a very different style of communicating. Sometimes there are no clear warning signs, but in most cases there are over a long period of time. And as you mentioned before, we are also, our own life is often busy, and we need to focus on ourselves. So sometimes we just can't see those signs.
Now, what about young people? I think I ran across one quote by a research psychologist, which said, quote, we're in the middle of a full-blown mental health crisis for adults and for adolescents, rather, and young adults, and that there's a serious problem here. And they seem to perhaps be under more pressure, perhaps, in times past. I'm not sure. But what do we make of that particular problem? Because I know, for instance, here on the Eastern Shore, we've had a number of cases where they were young people.
Yeah, so unfortunately the suicide rates in young adults went up quite a bit. And we're not 100% sure yet why, but there are certain factors as maybe exposure to social media. So we really encourage people to have a healthy social media relationship. Social media can be super helpful when it comes to talking about mental health, providing help. We can get important resources out to our youth, but social media can also be misused. So I encourage everyone using social media to have a healthy relationship with it. But there are certain stressors like school. I know from personal experience that kids often are very eager to accomplish certain things in school or in life, but it might just be too much for them, and you need to find a healthy balance. And what we have to keep in mind is that their brains are not developed yet. So sometimes the way they think, the way they process things is very different from an adult. So we need to make sure to let them know that adults are there for them, to help them to get through a problem and provide support when they're in crisis.
Do you think now we're really putting a lot more emphasis on trying to deal with this issue than perhaps we have done in the past? Obviously, we know a lot more than we did before, but there seems to be a lot more concern amongst people and much more awareness of the fact that there is suicide out there.
Yes, and I agree. So there's definitely more attention. We unfortunately had some high-profile suicides in the last couple of years. When I started working with the foundation 5 years ago, it was really hard for us to talk about this topic, to get funding, to just have a conversation with somebody, bring our programs into the community. This is much easier these days. People are way more open to talk about this topic. We often get asked to come into organizations or schools to talk about it. So I think there's a big change in how we talk about this and that we actually talk about it.
By the way, what do you make of some of these high-profile suicides? I know we had Anthony Bourdain, of course, and there was another actor whose name now escapes me who was prominent. What do we make of those?
So these are a little bit tricky because while we need to talk about suicide and suicide prevention, if we see somebody who's a celebrity who in our eyes maybe had everything they wanted, it's kind of irritating for us, and it might cause us some despair and sadness with their fans or supporters. Maybe people ask themselves, how am I supposed to go through my struggle if this person couldn't? So we have to always keep in mind that if somebody struggles with their mental health, it doesn't matter how rich they are or how many resources are available. It is sometimes really hard to find the right treatment or get the treatment in the right time. So unfortunately, if a high-profile suicide happens, you see an increase in suicides. But we also need to make sure that as an organization or as a community, we follow up with resources. So not only report about the suicide, but provide the Suicide Prevention Lifeline crisis number or the crisis text number so people can reach out and ask for help.
Now, we've been talking obviously about the state level here in Maryland. Is there something that the federal government should be doing, or should it be doing more, or can it do more, or is this basically a local issue?
So Maryland actually has a governor's commission on suicide prevention who meets on bi-monthly, meets every 2 months. And they are trying to figure out what we can do on a state level to prevent suicide. So there's different work groups focusing on education, means restriction, etc. So Maryland is actually really proactive. But each county, each city, each school, each organization can take matters in their own hands and reach out to us. We have several training programs to educate people on warning signs, how to reach out to a loved one. We also have support systems for people who have already been affected by suicide. So if you had a loss, you can call us up and we pair you with somebody who also had a loss, and they can guide you in the healing journey. So there's definitely resources out there, and they're available. We just need to make sure they get to everyone.
I want to return to something real quick, which is we've talked a lot about young people being affected. If people are teachers, for example, who really have the most intimate contact on a day-to-day basis with many children, what should they be looking for and what should they be doing? And they're obviously in a very touchy situation because on the one hand they have authority or they have responsibilities. On the other hand, they have to be careful about not intervening in necessarily family matters.
Mm-hmm. So actually in Maryland, it's the law that school staff is being educated about suicide prevention. So each year they have to do a program concerning suicide prevention. And each school has their own protocol on how to handle those delicate situations. But if you are, let's say, a math teacher and you're usually not confronted with this, I always would approach the student and ask if they're okay. If you feel there's something off or they don't want to talk to you, then please connect with the school counselor or the principal to see how the student can be helped. Always reach out to the parents. I think it's really important that the school system and the parents work together to keep our students safe. I'll always encourage open conversation about this topic and reaching out more than once, continue to reach out, keep those invitations going, just to make sure that the student knows that you're somebody that can be trusted.
What should a teacher be looking for?
The same warning signs I mentioned before. So if a kid is withdrawn or actually acts up in an interesting way, if they're aggressive or they're just not behaving the way they usually do, other signs might be signs of anxiety, rage, when they actually write something in an essay about taking their life. Kids are really good in dropping hints. So it's sometimes, our duty to pick up on those hints, which is difficult. But kids are usually more prone to actually speaking about their struggle. And they tend to reach out to an adult. We just need to see it.
How much of this, or how delicately should a teacher be acting in terms of the family itself? I mean, there might be some, obviously, bad family situations, which makes it even more difficult to, one, discern the signs, but then two, how to approach it, particularly if there's a conflict or a serious problem within the family.
Yeah, right. So, but each school has their own protocol on how to handle this. If you're not sure, definitely connect with your school counselor and the principal on how to handle this. And, they might have some other information on the family. But in general, I just encourage everyone to reach out no matter what. And if it's just about, asking, are you okay? Is there anything I can do for you?
So how optimistic are you that Annapolis will be responding to your efforts?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, how optimistic are you that Annapolis, the lawmakers, are going to be responding to your efforts there? You figure that there might be more programs, or what do you think?
Yeah, so actually we were invited to testify on some of the bills. So we hope that we can actually support them and make them law. I think in the last few years there has been a huge change. So when we started doing our state Capitol Day, legislators were a little bit hesitant, but we already scheduled 35 meetings, and there seems to be a good response and interest in working with us and actually bringing programs, education, and support for loss survivors to the different counties. So
you've seen a change in the lawmakers. Any sense about why that's happened, or is it just simply the general shift in public opinion?
Yes, I think there's definitely a shift of opinion, but also the needs. So I think they're starting to realize that mental health is really impacting everyone's life, and this is something that we can prevent and be proactive about to also then prevent suicide. So a lot of the legislators that we've been working with either had personal experience of a loss or mental health struggle, so they understand the need, and they also really want to make a change.
We were speaking with Kat Ulbrich. She's director of the Maryland and Delaware chapters of the American Foundation for the Prevention of Suicide, and the meeting in Annapolis with lawmakers. And we appreciate you taking time to speak with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Ranck. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. You can also watch Delmarva Today on PAC 14 by tuning into Comcast Channel 14 or youtube.com/PAC 14.